The sleek black SUV glided smoothly along the quiet late-night streets, its tires whispering against the asphalt. Keanu Reeves sat in the back seat, eyes half closed, his mind already racing ahead to the movie set he was headed to. The day had been long, the filming intense, and all he wanted now was a moment of peace, just a few minutes to decompress before another whirlwind of work. The hum of the engine was soothing, almost hypnotic, but something about the ride felt different tonight. His usual driver, Paul, hadn't spoken a word since Keanu got in, and it was unlike him. Most drivers would have at least greeted him with a friendly, "Good evening," or asked how his day went. But not Paul. There was an unusual silence between them, and Keanu couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. Keanu glanced at Paul through the rearview mirror, but the driver's face was mostly hidden in the shadows, his attention focused on the road ahead. Keanu let out a quiet sigh, deciding to break the silence. "You doing all right, Paul?" Paul didn't respond immediately, as if the question took a moment to process. When he did answer, it was with a faint, forced smile. "Yeah, just tired. It's been a long day." Keanu didn't buy it. Paul had been driving him for weeks now, and Keanu had gotten to know him a little. Paul wasn't one to shy away from small talk, but tonight he seemed distant, withdrawn. Keanu's curiosity got the best of him. "You sure?" Keanu pressed, his voice gentle, but there was a sense of concern beneath it. "You've seemed a little off lately. Is everything okay?" Paul stiffened ever so slightly, as though the question had caught him off guard. For a moment, there was nothing but the low rumble of the engine filling the air. Then Paul cleared his throat and shrugged, glancing briefly at the rearview mirror. "It's nothing," he replied quickly, as though brushing the topic away like dust off his shoulder. "Just a little worn out, you know. It's nothing to worry about." Keanu didn't push further right away. He could tell Paul was trying to deflect, but there was something about the way Paul spoke, almost too quickly, too evasively, that made Keanu's suspicion grow. The man had been driving him for a while now, but tonight there was an unease that hung in the air, thick as fog. The silence stretched between them again, but it didn't feel like the usual quiet of a late-night drive. This was something heavier. Keanu looked out the window at the passing lights, the reflection of neon signs flashing on the glass, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Paul. The guy had always seemed like he had his life together. Or at least, that's how it appeared on the surface. Keanu's eyes drifted down to Paul's worn shoes, the frayed edges of his shirt. There was an exhaustion in the way Paul held himself, a fatigue that went beyond the usual tiredness of someone who'd had a long shift. Keanu found himself wondering what was going on beneath the surface. The SUV took a turn onto a quieter street, and Keanu's gaze remained fixed on Paul's reflection in the mirror. After a beat, he decided to ask again, more softly this time, "You sure there's nothing you want to talk about? You know I'm not one to pry, but if you ever need someone to listen, I'm here." Paul's fingers tightened briefly around the steering wheel before he let out a small exhale, like he had been holding his breath. He glanced up at the rearview mirror, catching Keanu's gaze for the first time in the entire ride. His eyes were tired, haunted even, as if they held a story he wasn't ready to tell. "Thanks, man," Paul said after a pause, his voice quieter now. "Maybe one day I'll tell you the whole story." Keanu nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. He could tell Paul wasn't ready to open up, and that was okay. But something about the way Paul had said it, like he was carrying the weight of something too heavy to bear alone, stayed with him. Keanu wasn't sure what Paul was going through, but one thing was clear. It wasn't just a bad day. This was something deeper. Keanu leaned back in his seat, his mind racing with questions, but for now he let it go. Tonight's drive had taken a turn he hadn't expected. As the car continued its smooth ride through the city, Keanu realized that the simple exchange between them, brief as it was, had begun to make him rethink the way he saw people, his colleagues, his fans, even the strangers he crossed paths with every day. There was more to people than what they showed on the outside, and tonight Keanu had caught a glimpse of that truth in Paul's eyes. As the car turned onto the freeway, Keanu sat in the back, looking out the window. But the city, lights now felt distant, like a world away from the quiet, unspoken bond forming between him and his driver. The days passed, But Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. Paul's quiet demeanor weighed on him, and every time they drove together, Keanu couldn't help but notice how much Paul had retreated into himself. The moments of small talk between them had all but disappeared, replaced by long silences. Keanu respected Paul's space, but he also knew there was more to the story than what Paul was letting on. It had been a few days since their last conversation, and Keanu decided it was time to dig a little deeper. He'd had enough of the polite silence. Sometimes a small gesture could break through the walls people built around themselves, and Keanu had always believed that genuine kindness could make a difference. So, he decided that today would be the day to talk. As he climbed into the back seat of the SUV that evening, the night air was cool and the city lights seemed to blink in the distance. The hum of the engine was familiar, comforting even, as they began the drive through the bustling streets. But tonight, Keanu had no intention of staying silent. "Paul," Keanu began, his voice casual yet firm, "I know we don't really talk much outside of the job, but I've been thinking, are you doing okay? I mean, really?" Paul gave a brief nod, his eyes focused on the road, but there was a tension in his shoulders, as though the weight of his silence was becoming too much to carry. Keanu could see it now, clearer than before, Paul's nervous fidgeting, his quick glances toward the rearview mirror, and the way his jaw clenched every so often. "Yeah, man, I'm fine," Paul said, but there was an edge of unease in his voice, the kind you get when you're trying to convince yourself that everything is all right, even when it's not. Keanu studied him for a moment, then sighed. He wasn't buying it. "You know, I'm not just asking because I have to. I've been around enough to know when something's off." Paul didn't respond right away, but the words seemed to hang in the air, and for the first time in a while, Paul's usual calm expression faltered. He seemed to struggle for the right words, and Keanu could see the tension in his face deepening. Finally, Paul spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to talk about it, you know. I'm not looking for pity. I don't like to burden people with my problems." His words hung heavy in the car, and Keanu didn't press him further, giving him space to continue when he was ready. The silence stretched between them, but this time it felt different. Keanu wasn't going to let the conversation slide. He understood the discomfort people felt when they had to share their struggles, especially with someone they barely knew. But that didn't mean he wasn't going to try. "I'm not offering pity, Paul," Keanu said, his voice soft but unwavering. "I'm offering a chance for you to talk about it if you want. No pressure." Paul's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he seemed to weigh Keanu's words. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting fleeting shadows across Paul's face as he took a deep breath. Then finally, the words started to come out, slow and hesitant at first. "I've been living out of my car for a while now," Paul confessed. The words seemed to weigh him down as though they were something he'd been holding back for far too long. "Work's been tough and, well, things just fell apart." Keanu's heart sank as he processed the admission. He hadn't expected this. He'd noticed the signs: Paul's tired eyes, his worn-out shoes, his reluctance to talk about his life. But hearing the truth made it real, and Keanu couldn't help but feel a surge of empathy for the man sitting in front of him. Paul continued, his voice low, almost ashamed. "I'm just stuck. Every time I think I'm getting back on my feet, something happens. I try to find work, but I don't have a place to stay, and it's hard to stay motivated when you're living like this." Keanu sat in stunned silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of what Paul was saying. His heart ached for the man who had been quietly struggling, hiding his pain behind his stoic exterior. Keanu had always known there was more to Paul's story, but he hadn't realized just how much Paul had been carrying. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Keanu asked gently. "I could have helped. We could have figured something out." Paul shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't want anyone to feel sorry for me. I didn't want to seem weak. I'm just trying to keep it together, you know?" Keanu nodded. He understood all too well the desire to appear strong to avoid vulnerability. He'd been there himself, countless times. But something about Paul's honesty in that moment made Keanu feel a sense of responsibility. He couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Not now. You don't have to go through this alone, Paul, Keanu said, his voice firm but compassionate. I'm here, and I want to help. Paul shot him a skeptical glance, clearly unsure of Keanu's sincerity. Help? What do you mean by that? You don't even know me. Keanu smiled, a soft, reassuring smile that spoke more than words ever could. I know enough. You don't have to figure everything out on your own. Sometimes a little help is all it takes to start making things better. The car swerved slightly as Paul's eyes darted back and forth between the road and the rearview mirror. He wasn't sure what to say, but the sincerity in Keanu's voice seemed to put him at ease, even if just a little. I don't know, man. Paul trailed off, his voice filled with uncertainty. I don't want to take advantage of you. You've already been too kind. Keanu shook his head. This isn't about charity. It's about people looking out for each other. We all need help sometimes, and there's no shame in asking for it. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The car rolled on, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Keanu watched as Paul's tense shoulders seemed to relax a bit, as if, for the first time in a long time, he had been given permission to be vulnerable. Maybe I could use some help, Paul said quietly, the words feeling foreign but somehow freeing at the same time. Keanu smiled, his heart warming at the shift in Paul's tone. Whenever you're ready, Paul. Just know I've got your back. As they continued the drive, Keanu felt a strange sense of relief, not just for Paul but for himself as well. Sometimes a small gesture, just asking someone how they're doing, could be the spark that ignited change. And Keanu knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than a simple conversation. The drive might have been just another ride to the set, but for both of them, it was the start of a new chapter in their lives. The following days were filled with subtle changes. Paul seemed lighter, more at ease behind the wheel. The familiar, tense silence between them was slowly replaced by the occasional exchange of small stories or casual conversation. Keanu didn't press him for more details about his struggles, respecting the pace at which Paul was willing to open up. But there was a mutual understanding now. Keanu had given Paul the space to breathe, to talk when he was ready, and that made all the difference. It wasn't long before Keanu realized that despite the small improvements, Paul's situation hadn't changed much. He was still living, out of his car, still working long hours, and still struggling with the weight of uncertainty that came with his situation. Keanu felt that gnawing sense of responsibility again, knowing that he couldn't simply offer a few words of comfort and leave it at that. He had to do more. One afternoon after filming wrapped up, Keanu climbed into the back seat of the SUV, noticing immediately that something was different about Paul. There was a certain hesitation in the way he gripped the steering wheel, and his eyes seemed to be focused on the road, but not quite seeing it. Keanu could feel the tension in the air before he even spoke. Paul, Keanu said gently, leaning forward from the back seat. You all right? Paul swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the wheel. His voice was strained when he finally responded. I'm not sure. I don't know what to do anymore. Keanu's heart sank. He hadn't realized just how deep Paul's struggles had been, how close he was to giving up. Keanu didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Paul needed a change, and Keanu could help make that happen. Without hesitation, Keanu sat up straighter, his tone firm but compassionate. I want to help you, Paul. No strings attached. You've been kind to me, and it's time I return the favor. You're not in this alone anymore. Paul shook his head slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. But what can you do, Keanu? I'm just some guy driving you around. What do you owe me? Keanu leaned forward a little more, meeting Paul's eyes through the rearview mirror. I owe you a lot more than you think. You've been there for me, even when I didn't notice. You've always been professional, reliable, and kind. You deserve more than this. And I'm not just talking about a paycheck. I'm talking about a way out, an opportunity. Paul's eyes widened slightly, uncertainty flickering across his face. I don't even know what that would look like, he muttered. I don't even know where to start. Keanu smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile that spoke volumes. That's the first step, Paul. You've already started. You've opened up, and that's huge. Now let's figure out how to move forward." For the next few minutes the car was silent, except for the low hum of the engine. Keanu knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. It wasn't about offering quick fixes or empty promises. It was about finding a way to help Paul rebuild his life one step at a time, and Keanu wasn't going to let him back down. "Listen, I've got a place you can stay for a little while," Keanu said finally, his voice steady. "Not just a hotel or anything temporary, a real place, somewhere you can call home. You won't have to worry about where you're sleeping or what's next. You'll have a roof over your head, food, a place to reset. I want you to take it. I want you to take that time to breathe, to figure things out." Paul's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, and Keanu could tell he was processing the offer. There was disbelief in his eyes, a fear of accepting help that ran deeper than the offer itself. "You don't have to do this for me," Paul said, his voice small, almost fragile. "I don't want to impose. You have your own life, your own things to focus on." Keanu's response was immediate and firm. "This is not an imposition, Paul. I want to do this. You're not imposing on me. I want to see you succeed. I know it's hard to accept help, but sometimes we need a hand to pull us out of the dark. This isn't charity, it's a partnership." Paul's eyes were misty now, and Keanu could see the wariness, the self-doubt, begin to melt away. The offer was more than just a place to stay. It was the promise of hope, of support, of someone believing in him when he had long stopped believing in himself. "I don't know what to say," Paul finally murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think anyone would care. I didn't think anyone would even notice." Keanu shook his head, his voice soft but certain. "You've got it all wrong, Paul. People care. I care. And I know you've got so much potential. You just need the chance to show it." The car drifted through the streets, but this time it wasn't just the city lights that illuminated the road ahead. It was the newfound understanding between the two men. Keanu knew that it wasn't just about giving Paul a place to stay or helping him find his way again. It was about showing him that he was worthy of love, of support, and of a fresh start. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," Keanu repeated softly. "And I'm not going anywhere." By the time they reached their destination, the tension in the car had lifted. The weight that had hung between them for days seemed to dissipate, leaving behind only the sense of a new beginning. Keanu knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to walk it with Paul, one step at a time. Paul pulled into the parking lot, his eyes no longer clouded with doubt, but instead filled with a glimmer of hope. He had a long journey ahead, but for the first time in a while he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. As they parked, Keanu put a hand on his shoulder, offering a simple, encouraging smile. "We'll figure it out, Paul. Together." And in that moment, Keanu knew that this small act of kindness would change everything for both of them. The days following that pivotal conversation between Keanu and Paul were filled with a sense of uncertainty, but also a quiet optimism. Keanu had kept his promise. He helped Paul secure a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a place where Paul could begin to rebuild his life without constantly worrying about where he would sleep next. It wasn't luxurious, but it was a start. A roof over his head, a bed to sleep in, and the peace of mind that came with not having to fight for survival every day. Keanu checked in on Paul regularly, not just as a benefactor but as a friend. He knew that giving Paul the space he needed was just as important as offering help. Sometimes people needed time to process the changes happening in their lives, especially when they were so used to relying on themselves. But Keanu didn't let Paul fall through the cracks. He was there to support him, to help him get back on his feet. And he made sure Paul knew that he was never alone, even when it felt like the world was too big and overwhelming. Paul, for his part, was hesitant at first. It was one thing to accept a roof over his head, but it was another to truly believe that he deserved it, that he wasn't just some charity case. But little by little, with each conversation, each small gesture, he began to trust in the process. He found himself starting to breathe a little easier, his shoulders less tense, his mind less clouded. One afternoon, Keanu invited Paul to meet him for coffee. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Paul, who hadn't had the chance. to sit down and enjoy a simple moment like this in a long time. They met at a cozy cafe in the city, the kind of place with warm wooden floors and the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the air. Paul arrived early, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket as he waited outside. When Keanu pulled up, in his car, Paul greeted him with a small smile. There was something different about him now, something lighter in the way he carried himself. It wasn't just the new apartment or the promise of support. It was the spark of hope that had reignited within him. "Hey, Paul," Keanu greeted him with a friendly nod as he stepped out of the car. "Hey," Paul replied, his voice a little more upbeat than it had been in the past. He seemed like he was still getting used to the idea of people caring, but his guard was slowly coming down. "Thanks for meeting me here, it's nice. Of course, I figured it'd be good to catch up outside of the car, right?" Keanu said with a chuckle. "Plus, I heard the coffee here's the best in town. You ready to try it?" Paul smiled a little, a faint trace of humor in his eyes. "Yeah, sure. Why not?" They walked inside, the warmth of the cafe enveloping them. Keanu led them to a small corner booth, and they both sat down. For a few minutes, they talked casually about work, the city, and the things that kept them busy. Paul still had a bit of hesitance in his voice, but the more Keanu spoke with him, the more Paul seemed to open up, letting down the walls he'd spent so long building. As they sipped their coffee, Keanu leaned back in his chair, looking at Paul with a serious but caring expression. "I've been thinking about what comes next for you, Paul," he said. "Now that you've got a place, it's time to think about what you want to do. What's your next move?" Paul hesitated, his fingers wrapped around the warm mug. "I don't know," he said quietly. "It's hard to think about the future when you've been stuck in survival mode for so long, but I guess I'm starting to believe that maybe I can do something more. Maybe I can actually get back to work, find something I really enjoy." Keanu nodded, offering an encouraging smile. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear. You've got the tools, Paul. You've just been waiting for the right opportunity. You don't have to settle for just anything. You can do something that excites you, something that makes you feel alive." Paul looked down at his coffee, processing Keanu's words. "I used to love working on cars. I mean, that was always my thing. But I didn't know if I'd ever get back into it. I thought I'd missed my chance." "You haven't missed anything, Paul," Keanu reassured him. "It's never too late to start again. You've got the skills, and now you've got the space to make it happen. If that's what you want, go for it. I'll help however I can." Paul's eyes flickered with something close to determination, and Keanu could see the spark of hope growing brighter. The idea of returning to something he loved, something he was good at, it gave him purpose again. It gave him a reason to believe that things could be different. "Thanks, Keanu," Paul said, his voice full of gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Keanu waved it off, shaking his head. "It's nothing, Paul. You're the one doing the hard work. You're the one making the changes. I'm just here to help you see that you've got what it takes." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them absorbing the weight of the conversation. It wasn't just about the help Keanu had given. It was about the transformation that was happening within Paul. The realization that he wasn't trapped anymore, that there was a way out and that he had the power to take control of his life again. "I think I'm ready," Paul said finally, his voice filled with newfound confidence. "I'm going to start looking for a place where I can work on cars again. Maybe I can even open my own shop someday." Keanu's eyes lit up. "Now that's the spirit. I know you've got it in you, Paul. I'm proud of you." The conversation drifted into lighter topics as they finished their coffee, but the message was clear. Paul was ready for a fresh start. And while the road ahead would still have its challenges, Keanu knew that this was just the beginning of Paul's journey, a journey he didn't have to face alone anymore. As they stood to leave, Keanu clapped Paul on the back with a grin. "Let's keep this momentum going, all right? I'm here for you every step of the way." Paul smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thanks, Keanu, really, I'll make it count." Keanu watched as Paul walked out of the cafe, a little taller, a little more confident. It wasn't just the job or the apartment that had changed. Paul's entire outlook on life was shifting, and Keanu knew that no matter what happened next, This was a moment they'd both remember. A small act of kindness had sparked something much bigger than either of them had imagined. The weeks that followed were transformative for Paul. Every day he seemed to take another step toward rebuilding his life, and Keanu was there to watch it unfold. At first the progress was slow. Small moments of victory, like waking up in a bed that wasn't in a car, or finding a job opening at a local auto repair shop. But it wasn't just the external changes that mattered. What Keanu saw in Paul was the quiet confidence growing inside him, the fire of self-belief that had been extinguished so long ago. Paul's first day at the auto shop was a mix of excitement and anxiety. Keanu had arranged a meeting with the shop owner, a tough yet kind-hearted man named Greg, who had agreed to give Paul a trial run. "It's up to him," Greg had said, with a gruff but reassuring tone. "He's got the skills, but it's about showing up and working hard." The morning of Paul's first shift, Keanu gave him a call to check in. Paul picked up after the first ring. "Hey man, how's it going? Ready for your first day?" Keanu's voice was light but full of genuine encouragement. "Yeah, I think so," Paul replied, his nerves barely masked by the excitement in his voice. "I mean, I know I can do it, but it's just been a while, you know? I don't want to mess up." "You won't mess up," Keanu reassured him. "You've got this. Just remember, it's not about being perfect, it's about showing up and doing your best. That's what counts." Paul took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. "Thanks, Keanu, seriously, I wouldn't be here without you." Keanu smiled to himself, happy to hear the shift in Paul's tone. "I'm just the guy who believed in you. You're the one putting in the work." After they hung up, Paul headed to the shop, his heart pounding in his chest. The building was modest, tucked, away on a quiet street. The faint smell of oil and metal hung in the air, familiar and comforting to Paul. He hadn't realized how much he missed the sounds of tools clinking and the hum of engines being brought back to life. Greg was waiting outside when Paul arrived, his arms crossed and a serious look on his face. "You ready to get to work?" he asked. Paul nodded, wiping his palms on his jeans. "Yeah, I'm ready." The first few hours were a blur of oil changes, tire rotations, and engine diagnostics. Paul's hands worked with an automatic ease, as though they had never forgotten the movements. But there were moments of uncertainty, too, times when Paul hesitated, unsure of himself. But Greg was patient, offering helpful critiques and encouragement. By lunchtime, Paul was feeling more comfortable, like he had earned his place there. When his shift ended, Greg clapped him on the back. "Good work today, Paul. You've got potential. I'll see you tomorrow." Paul walked out of the shop that evening with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. It was more than just fixing cars. It was the feeling of having purpose again, of doing something he loved. It was like a part of him that had been dormant was waking up, piece by piece. Keanu picked him up after his shift. "How was it?" he asked as Paul climbed into the car, his face glowing with a mix of tiredness and pride. "It was amazing," Paul said, his voice cracking slightly. "I can't believe how much I've missed this. The work, the satisfaction of fixing something with my own hands. It's like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Keanu grinned. "I'm glad to hear it. I knew you had it in you." Over the next few weeks, Paul settled into the routine of his new job. He woke up early, went to work, and came home exhausted but fulfilled. It wasn't easy, and there were days when he doubted himself, but Keanu was always there to offer support and encouragement. They would meet up after work, sometimes for coffee or a walk in the park, and Paul would share his small victories, finishing a particularly difficult repair, impressing Greg with his work ethic, or simply feeling like he was part of something again. But even as Paul's confidence grew, there were moments when the weight of his past would sneak up on him. The memories of sleeping in his car, the shame of not being able to provide for himself, it all still lingered. Some nights, he would lie awake in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he truly deserved this second chance. Evening, as they sat together at a small diner after Paul's shift, Keanu noticed the tiredness in his friend's eyes. Paul had been unusually quiet that night, his fingers tapping nervously against his coffee cup. "Something on your mind?" Keanu asked gently, his voice low. Paul hesitated, his eyes shifting to the side. "I don't know. Some days, I feel like I'm still that guy. The guy who couldn't even get a roof over his head. I've been doing well, but I don't know if I'm ever going to shake off the past." Keanu's gaze softened, and he leaned forward, looking directly into Paul's eyes. "You're not that guy anymore, Paul. You're not the guy who sleeps in his car and wonders where his next meal is coming from. You're the guy who's rebuilding his life, step by step. It's okay to have those moments of doubt. It's part of the process, but don't let your past define you. You're moving forward, and that's what matters." Paul looked down, the weight of Keanu's words settling on him. It was hard to let go of the past, to stop seeing himself as someone who had failed. But Keanu was right. He was different now. He was strong enough to face the challenges ahead, even if it meant confronting the scars left by his struggles. "Thanks," Paul said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I guess I just needed to hear that." Keanu smiled, his hand resting lightly on Paul's shoulder. "Anytime. I'm proud of you, Paul. You've come a long way." Paul nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yeah, I guess I have." As they finished their coffee and headed back to Paul's apartment, Keanu knew that this was just the beginning for his friend. The road ahead would still be difficult, filled with challenges and setbacks, but Paul had proven that he had the strength to keep going. He had found his way back to what mattered, to his passion, to his purpose, and to a life that was truly his to shape. And Keanu? He was simply grateful to have played a small part in Paul's journey. Sometimes a little kindness was all it took to change the course of someone's life. Weeks turned into months, and Paul's life continued to evolve. His confidence was no longer just a flicker of hope. It was a steady, glowing fire that pushed him forward, even on the days when things felt impossible. He'd settled into a rhythm, waking up early to head to the shop and spending the rest of his evenings quietly in his apartment. The change in him was visible, not just in his work, but in the way he held himself. He no longer felt like he was simply surviving. He was living. But despite his newfound sense of stability, Paul hadn't fully given up on a dream that had been in the back of his mind since he was young. He had always wanted to open his own auto repair shop, a place where he could not only work on cars but build something lasting. It was the dream that had kept him going during the darkest moments of his homelessness, the thing he held on to when everything else seemed impossible. But it had always seemed out of reach, until now. One afternoon, Keanu met Paul for lunch, at their usual cafe. They sat in their favorite corner, the sunlight streaming through the windows as they ate their sandwiches and talked about everything and nothing. As always, Keanu was there, listening, supporting, and encouraging. Paul had become more than just a friend. He was a reminder to Keanu that the power of a second chance was real. As they finished their meal, Paul shifted in his seat, his hands nervously fidgeting with the napkin in front of him. Keanu raised an eyebrow, sensing that something was on Paul's mind. "What's up, man? You've been quiet today." Paul took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about something. I've been saving up a little, and I've been looking at some small shop spaces around town. I know it's a huge step, but I think I'm ready to open my own place. A repair shop, my own business." Keanu leaned back, taking a moment to let the words sink in. He had seen this coming, the quiet determination in Paul's eyes, the way he talked about cars, the way he lit up when he worked. It was clear that Paul wasn't just working at the shop to make ends meet. He was doing it because it was his passion, the thing that made him feel alive. And now, he was ready to take the leap. "That's amazing, Paul," Keanu said, his voice full of excitement. "I've seen the way you've been working. You've got the skills, the drive. If anyone can make this happen, it's you." Paul smiled, but there was a hint of hesitation behind his eyes. "I don't know, Keanu. It's a big risk. What if it doesn't work out? What if I fail? I've already been through so much, I don't want to go back to square one." Keanu's expression softened. "You've come so far, Paul. You've already proven that you're capable of handling challenges. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but nothing worth having ever is. You're not the same guy you were when I met you. You've got a foundation. Now, you're not starting from scratch." Paul looked down at the table, taking in Keanu's words. It was true, he wasn't starting from scratch anymore. He had built a life from the ground up, brick by brick. The fear still lingered, but deep down he knew that he couldn't let that fear control him. He had already faced the worst of it, being homeless, having nothing, and yet he was still here. If he could survive that, surely he could take on this next challenge. "I guess you're right," Paul said finally, his voice steadier than before. "I've been through worse. I've always dreamed of doing this, and maybe it's time to stop holding back." Keanu grinned. "That's the spirit. I'll be here to help you every step of the way, you know that, right?" Paul nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. "Thanks, man, seriously. I don't think I'd be here without you." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning. Paul spent every spare moment researching, budgeting, and looking at possible locations for his new shop. It wasn't easy, and there were many moments when the weight of the task felt overwhelming. He had to make decisions about leasing space, hiring employees, and securing the right tools. But with Keanu's continued support, Paul pushed forward. Keanu helped in ways he never expected, offering advice, helping with the financials, and even putting in a good word with some of his connections. Keanu's influence and status helped open doors that might have been closed otherwise. The grand opening of Paul's auto repair shop was still months away, but the process was already starting to feel real. Every decision, every step forward, felt like a victory, a testament to how far Paul had come. One night, after another long day of work, Paul stood outside the empty shop he'd secured. The walls were bare, the floors covered in dust, but in his mind's eye he could already see it. See the bustling shop, the cars being repaired, the satisfaction of a job well done. For the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of peace. The dream that had once seemed so distant was now within reach. He wasn't just rebuilding his life, he was creating something that would last. Keanu pulled up in his car, stepping out and walking over to join Paul. "Looking good, man," Keanu said, clapping him on the back. "This place is going to be great." Paul turned to him, a smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, it's starting to feel real now." Keanu stood beside him, gazing at the empty shop that was soon to become something much more. "You know, this is just the beginning for you, Paul. It's going to be a lot of work, but I know you're up for it." "I am," Paul said, his voice full of quiet confidence. "I've been through worse and I've learned a lot. I'm ready." Keanu nodded. "I'm proud of you, man. You've come a long way, and I can't wait to see what you do with this." As they stood there side by side looking at the future that Paul was building, Keanu couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. This wasn't just about helping someone get back on their feet. It was about witnessing the power of second chances, the resilience of the human spirit, and the beauty of friendship. And as Paul took that next step toward his dream, Keanu knew that he had played a small but pivotal part in it. And for Paul, he had learned that it wasn't just the big moments that mattered, it was the little ones, the quiet steps forward, that made all the difference. And as he looked toward the future, he knew he wasn't alone. The opening day of Paul's auto repair shop finally arrived. After months of preparation, the grand unveiling was more than just a business launch. It was a personal triumph, a culmination of everything he had fought for since that first fateful encounter with Keanu. There was an undeniable sense of excitement in the air as Paul unlocked the doors of his new shop, the smell of fresh paint and polished floors greeting him as he stepped inside. The space was small, but to Paul it felt enormous, a blank canvas ready to be filled with hard work, dedication, and the dream he had held on to for so long. Keanu arrived early to offer his support, as he had promised. He stood by the counter, watching as Paul went over his last-minute preparations, checking everything from the tools on the wall to the tire racks. "You ready for this?" Keanu asked, a mischievous grin on his face. Paul wiped his hands on his apron and looked up, his nerves apparent. "I think so. It's a little nerve-wracking, honestly. What if no one comes in?" Keanu chuckled. "Hey, don't worry about that. You've got the skills. People will notice, plus I'll be spreading the word to everyone I know. You've got this." Despite Keanu's reassuring words, Paul still felt the pressure. His dream had been his lifeline during the toughest times of his life, and now that dream was finally becoming a reality. But with that came the fear of failure, the fear that despite all his hard work, it might not be enough. As the hours passed, the shop remained quiet. Paul's anxiety grew. He kept glancing at the clock, waiting for someone to walk through the door. Keanu, ever the optimist, kept the mood light. He cracked jokes, reminisced about their time together, and reminded Paul that it was just the beginning. But inside, Paul's mind raced. The silence was finally broken when a car pulled up outside. Paul's heart skipped a beat as he looked up from his workbench. A woman stepped out of the car, a middle-aged figure with a tired look on her face. She had that same worn-out expression Paul used to have, the kind of look that suggested she'd been through her own share of struggles. Keanu noticed Paul's nervousness. "Hey, you got this," he said, giving him a light shove toward the customer. "It's showtime." Paul took a deep breath, wiped his hands on his apron again, and made his way to the front of the shop to greet the woman. "Hi, welcome. How can I help you today?" Paul asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The woman gave him a tentative smile. "Hi there, I've been having some trouble with my car. It's been making this weird noise when I drive, and I just don't know what's going on with it." Paul nodded, trying to mask his nervousness. "No problem. We'll take a look at it for you. Let me get some details and we'll figure out what's going on." As Paul moved to check out the car, Keanu watched from the sidelines, nodding encouragingly. It wasn't a huge job, just a simple engine check, but for Paul, it was the first test of many. He had to prove to himself that he was capable of doing this, not just for the customer, but for the dream that had become so much more than just a business. The woman stood nearby as Paul worked, and Keanu kept up light conversation with her, to ease the tension. "How did you find out about us?" Keanu asked with a grin. "This is Paul's big opening day." The woman's face softened. "Actually, I heard about the shop from a friend of mine. I'm just hoping you guys can help. I really need this car fixed. It's the only way I can get to work." Paul took a moment to step back from the car, wiping sweat from his brow. He stood there inspecting the engine. He didn't have a magic fix, but he knew enough to get to the root of the issue. With a quiet confidence, he started troubleshooting, taking each step methodically, trusting his hands to do what he had been trained to do. The hours ticked by, and Keanu kept himself busy by chatting with customers who had started to trickle in. It wasn't a flood of business, but it was enough to show Paul that his work was already starting to pay off. By the end of the day, Paul had fixed the woman's car, replacing a worn-out part and resolving the issue. She was more than pleased. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice full of relief. "You have no idea how much this means to me. I didn't know where else to go. I'm really glad I found you." Paul smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I'm glad I could help. Take care, and come back if you need anything else." As the woman drove off, Keanu approached Paul, clapping him on the back. "See? Told you it would be fine. You nailed it." Paul let out a long breath, his nerves slowly melting away. "Yeah, but that was just the first one. What if the next customer has a bigger problem? What if I don't know how to fix it?" Keanu laughed. "Hey, that's part of it. No one knows everything. But you've got the skills and you've got the heart. That's what's going to make you great. Just keep doing your best and it'll all work out." For the first time that day, Paul felt the weight of his doubts begin to lift. He knew there would be challenges ahead, days when the pressure would be unbearable, when the fear of failure would creep back in. But in that moment, he realized that he was stronger than his fears. He had made it this far, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him now. As the sun set and the last customer left, Keanu stuck around to help clean up. They stood in the empty shop, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. "Feels pretty good, huh?" Keanu said, breaking the silence. Paul looked around, taking it all in. "Yeah, it's only the beginning, but it feels like something real. Like I'm finally doing something I was meant to do." Keanu smiled. "It's more than just fixing cars, Paul. You're fixing your life, and you're building something that's gonna last." Paul nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "Thanks for everything, Keanu. I couldn't have done this without you." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Hey, you did all the work. I'm just here to cheer you on." Paul's smile widened as he looked around his new shop. It was far from perfect, and the road ahead would be long, but it was his. And for the first time in a long time, Paul truly believed that everything was going to be okay. The next chapter of his life was just beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. Paul's auto repair shop was gaining momentum. Word of mouth was spreading, and each day brought new customers through the door. It wasn't always easy. There were long hours, tough repairs, and the occasional frustration. But Paul felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. This was more than just a business to him. It was proof that dreams could come true, even after the darkest of times. But as his shop started to thrive, so did the pressure. As much as Paul had wanted to succeed, he hadn't anticipated the weight of responsibility that would come with it. He wasn't just fixing cars anymore, he was running a business. And the business side of things was not as simple as he'd hoped. One evening after closing, Paul sat at the desk in his small office, going over his finances. The numbers weren't adding up the way he'd hoped. Despite his growing clientele, the cost of supplies and the overhead of the shop were eating into his profits more than he'd anticipated. The weight of running the business was starting to take its toll on him. His mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong. What if he didn't make enough to keep the lights on? What if the shop wasn't profitable enough to stay open? As he was about to close the books and call it a night, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Keanu. Keanu. Hey, just checking in. How's everything going with the shop? Need a hand with anything? Paul sighed, rubbing his temples. He typed a quick response, Paul. Honestly, things are tight right now. I'm barely breaking even. I didn't expect the overhead to be this high. I'm trying to figure it out, but I don't know if I'm going to make it. It only took a moment before Keanu replied. Keanu, don't stress. I know it's tough, but you've got this. Take it one step at a time. I'm around if you need to talk. Paul stared at the screen for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He'd come so far. But now, with the stakes higher than ever, the reality of being a business owner was becoming overwhelming. He needed to make some hard decisions, and fast. The next morning, Paul walked into the shop, determined to face the challenge head-on. He spent the day reaching out to suppliers, looking for ways to cut costs, and brainstorming ideas for additional services to offer. He even began researching business loans and grants that might help ease the financial burden. But no matter how much he planned, the fear of failure continued to gnaw at him. What if it wasn't enough? That afternoon, the shop was busier than usual, with 2 cars waiting for repairs and a line forming at the counter. Paul was trying to juggle everything, answering customer questions, overseeing repairs, and managing the front desk. It was chaotic, but he could feel the adrenaline keeping him going. But even the rush of work couldn't block out the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Just as Paul was finishing up a repair on an old sedan, the door opened with a jingle. A tall, well-dressed man walked in, holding a clipboard. He looked around the shop, scanning the walls and the few cars that were parked inside. Paul wiped his hands on a rag and approached him. "Can I help you?" The man smiled politely. "Yeah, I'm looking for the owner of this shop." "That's me," Paul said, extending his hand. "I'm Paul." The man shook his hand, his grip firm. "I'm John Henderson. I've been following your progress for a while now. I'm an investor. I've been in the auto repair business for years, and I think you have a good thing going here." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Investor? What exactly do you mean?" John glanced around the shop again, this time more scrutinizing. "I think you're at a crossroads. Your shop has potential, but from what I can tell, you're struggling with cash flow. I have the resources to help you grow. I can provide you with capital, business advice, and connections in the industry. In return, I'd want a stake in the business." Paul felt a rush of conflicting emotions. On one hand, the idea of having an investor might solve his current financial problems. On the other hand, he wasn't sure if he was ready to give up a part of his dream. "I'm not sure," Paul said, shaking his head. "I've been doing this on my own. I want to see if I can make it work without bringing in outside help. It's just, I'm not sure if I'm doing enough to make it work." John studied him for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Listen, Paul, I get it. You've built something here. But sometimes we all need help. I'm not asking you to give up everything. I'm offering a partnership, not a takeover. You can still run the shop the way you want, but with the resources to make it thrive." Paul hesitated. He hadn't expected an offer like this. It was tempting. The pressure of keeping the shop afloat was starting to get to him, but at the same time, there was something in his gut telling him to think it over carefully. "I'll think about it," Paul said still. uncertain. "But I'm not making any decisions right now," John smiled, seemingly understanding Paul's hesitation. "Take your time. I'll leave my card. Think about it, and when you're ready, give me a call." As John left the shop, Paul stood, still for a moment contemplating the offer. The idea of an investor was both thrilling and terrifying. Could he trust someone else to help him build the business? Would he be able to maintain control of his dream, or would he lose it in the EE process? Paul walked over to the counter, sitting down with a deep sigh. He looked out at the empty parking lot, feeling a weight settle on his shoulders. He wasn't used to asking for help. He had done everything himself so far. But now, with the stakes higher than ever, the idea of partnership was becoming more appealing. As the hours passed, Paul sat with his thoughts, weighing the pros and cons of the offer. By the time Keanu showed up later that evening, Paul was exhausted, not from the work, but from the decision he now had to make. Keanu noticed immediately that something was off. "What's going on, man? You look like you've been running a marathon." Paul ran a hand through his hair and sighed. "I've been thinking about something. An investor came in today. He thinks I need some help. He's offering me capital, advice and connections to help me grow the business, but I'm not sure if I should take the offer. I don't know if I'm ready to give up a part of the shop, or if I even want to bring someone else in." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "That's a big decision, man. But look, it's not about giving up control. If you think this guy can help you, it could be a good move. But you've got to be sure it's what you want. If you're feeling iffy, don't rush it." Paul nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know. I just need some time to think about it. But it's hard. I didn't expect this to be so complicated." Keanu sat down beside him, offering a reassuring smile. "Hey, nothing worth having ever is. Whatever you decide, I've got your back." Paul gave a small smile in return. "Thanks, Keanu. I don't know what I'd do without you." As Paul looked around his shop, the weight of the decision ahead seemed daunting, but Keanu's words gave him a sense of calm. Whatever he chose, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. The future of the shop was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Paul felt like he had the strength to face whatever came next. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. Paul wrestled with the idea of bringing an investor on board, trying to balance the need for financial stability with his desire to maintain control over his dream. The pressure was mounting as more customers came through the door, and the costs of running the business continued to rise. Despite the progress he'd made, Paul knew he was facing a crossroads. Keanu, ever the supportive friend, checked in regularly. He could see how much the weight of the decision was eating at Paul, and he knew his friend was struggling. "I think you're overthinking this, man," Keanu said one afternoon, sitting on the stool by the counter as Paul worked on an old Jeep. "It's okay to ask for help. You've been doing this on your own for a while now, and you've done an amazing job. But maybe this is the next step. It doesn't mean you've failed, it just means you're building something bigger." Paul wiped the grease off his hands and leaned against the workbench. "I don't want to lose control of this place, Keanu. This shop, it's everything to me. It's more than just business. It's the one thing I've worked for, fought for, and now it's just hard to think about sharing it with someone else." Keanu looked at him, his expression understanding. "I get it, I do. But what you've built here is incredible. If you're going to make it even bigger, you'll need more resources. An investor doesn't have to take control. You're still the one running the show. It's just about getting the tools you need to keep going." Paul considered his friend's words. He had always been fiercely independent, but perhaps this was the right moment to admit that he couldn't do it all alone. He had already come so far, but the road ahead required more than just his skills as a mechanic. It required business, acumen, financial backing, and perhaps even a little guidance from someone who knew the industry better. Finally, after days of soul-searching, Paul made his decision. He contacted John Henderson and agreed to meet. The meeting was set for the following week. As Paul prepared for it, his heart raced with nervous excitement. He had made up his mind, but there was still a lingering fear of the unknown. Would this partnership really work out? Or would he lose the very thing he had fought so hard to build? On the day of the meeting, Paul arrived at a small, modern office building in downtown. He was dressed in his best clothes, an attempt to look professional despite his usual work-worn appearance. When he walked into the office, John greeted him with a handshake and a smile. "Good to see you, Paul," John said, motioning for him to take a seat. "I'm glad you're here." Paul sat down, his nerves still gnawing at him. "Thanks for meeting with me. I've been thinking a lot about your offer." John nodded, his expression neutral. "I understand it's a big decision. I want to make sure you're comfortable with whatever we decide. This partnership is meant to be beneficial for both of us." Paul took a deep breath, looking directly at John. "I've thought it through and I'm ready to move forward. I'd like to accept your offer." John's eyes lit up and he leaned forward, extending his hand. "That's great to hear. I think this will be a very successful partnership." They shook hands, sealing the deal. For Paul, it felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He was nervous about the changes ahead, but also strangely relieved. He had made the right choice, one that would allow him to keep his dream alive while gaining the support he needed to grow it. Over the next few weeks, the changes began to take shape. John's resources and advice helped streamline the shop's operations, and with the additional capital, Paul was able to invest in new tools, upgrade the shop's equipment, and even hire a couple of extra hands to help with the workload. The improvements were immediate, and the shop was thriving more than ever. But even with the success, Paul knew he had made the right choice, not because of the money or the growth, but because of the relationships he had built along the way. Keanu remained a constant presence in his life, offering support, encouragement, and friendship. And now, with the partnership with John, Paul felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had built this from the ground up, and now he was taking it to the next level. One evening after closing the shop, Paul sat down in the office with Keanu. The two of them had become so close during the past year, and now they shared the excitement of the shop's success together. "I did it," Paul said with a grin, leaning back in his chair. "I took the deal. It's official. We're partners." Keanu raised his eyebrows in surprise, then smiled broadly. "That's awesome, man. I knew you could do it. You've earned this." Paul chuckled, looking around the shop. "It's crazy to think about how far we've come. From that first day when I thought I was going to lose it all, to now I feel like I've found my place." Keanu nodded. "You have, man. You really have. And don't forget, it's not just about fixing cars. You're building something real. You're helping people. You've made this place something special." Paul's eyes softened as he looked at Keanu, his gratitude evident. "I couldn't have done it without you, Keanu. You were there from the beginning when I thought everything was falling apart. You've been my rock." Keanu waved him off, his trademark grin spreading across his face. "You did the work, Paul. I just gave you a push when you needed it. This place, it's all you." Paul smiled, his heart full. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but now, with the support of Keanu and the new partnership, he knew he had found his way. He had built something that mattered, not just for him, but for the community, for his customers, and for his friends. "Here's to new beginnings," Paul said, raising an imaginary glass. "To the future." Keanu lifted his coffee mug in response. "To the future, man." And as the two of them sat in the quiet shop, the sound of the city humming outside, Paul realized that no matter what the future held, he was ready. He had found his place, his purpose, and the people who would help him along the way. The dream had become a reality, and it was only just beginning.